Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we are with Inquisitor Greyfax, an artifact deck. I hope everyone's been doing really well. I had to take the week off last week because I got a cold, which is pretty embarrassing in the start of summer, but it does happen. I hope everyone's been enjoying Magic lately and has been enjoying the content of the channel. I've been trying to make sure that the things we're putting out are things that you're interested in. Right now, it continues to be generally this breakdown of commander decks, but to be fair, I think every now and then some change could be warranted. So if there's anything people are more interested in, I know I've made a few episodes that are more educational, that take a little bit more of my time, but feel a little more satisfying. Or I've done a little while back, a few budget look-ats, looking at older sets and what budget pickups for Commander are particularly good. Or if there's an idea that I haven't thought of that you want to throw my way, I'd love to hear it. I've been enjoying doing the work for this channel, but I want to make sure it's engaging and there's still a lot to do and people are still interested. I know there is kind of a theoretical limit to how popular this channel can be due to the nature of us looking at single decks at a time, but I'm always interested in trying new things and expanding. Alright, all that aside, let's take a look at the deck for today. So this is Inquisitor Greyfax. It comes to us by Xavier. Thank you for supporting the channel. They say that they want this to be a simple bracket 3 deck with nothing too fancy or overpowering. It's built around making clues and either turning them into beaters or sacrificing them to drain the table. But the issues that they're finding is that first, they don't make a lot of clues, and second, it takes a long time to end the game. As for budget, they want to leave things around this amount of game changers, and they don't want to increase the budget too much, which I think is very reasonable. And I think there's a lot we can say. So Inquisitor Greyfax is a very particular kind of artifact deck. It is an engine deck. And there's a lot of different ways to build engine decks, and we'll get into more of that in a minute. But I think this is already a pretty strong, example of one. Generally, what I'm looking at here is I think we're going to be fine-tuning it a little bit. Just exchanging cards here and there to kind of smooth out the deck to make sure it gets to its strongest parts at the right time. But before we get into that, we're going to take a look at the commander and see what we can do. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. So who is Inquisitor Greyfax and why are they our artifact deck commander? Or should I say a clue deck commander? Inquisitor Greyfax is a 4-mana Esper, that's white, blue, black, human Inquisitor. They have Vigilance, they're a 3/3, and they have 2 abilities. The first one says other creatures you control get +1/+0 and have Vigilance. And the second one, which is the much more important one, that is 1, tap target creature an opponent controls, and investigate. So what does that kind of mean for an artifact deck? Well, artifact decks tend to rely on their commander to be kind of I'm going to say usually either very much so the enabler or the payoff for the artifact deck. And Inquisitor Greyfax is very specifically kind of a gentle enabler. She is here to kind of control the board to prevent key attacks here and there, and then to, by doing this, create a slow flow of clues. If you can imagine this being a creature that said once per turn cycle you get a clue for 1 mana, that's essentially what she does. Now, the idea here that makes her a little tricky, and I'm not suggesting that we switch the commander, but she's kind of underpowered and overcosted for what she wants to do. What her main problem is that we are generating clues. Clues are worth less than draws and can be seen as, a mana sink. But Inquisitor Greyfax herself is very much so a mana sink as well, right? You're paying extra mana that you haven't used in your turn into her to gain an artifact that is also a hole to sink your extra mana into, right? And we're kind of getting around that in a way I really do like by using other ways to take advantage of clues and getting some extra advantage, by having the clues be cards we can sacrifice, or on enter the battlefield they generate these kind of bonuses. So we are making the most out of her, which makes her stronger, but still makes her kind of tough to work with. All that to say, what we need to be looking at this, as I said before, is an engine deck. So what is an engine deck for those who don't know? An engine deck is a deck that's built around card combinations. When you have 3 to 4 specific or non-specific cards on the battlefield, and their interactions in between each other allow for you to be getting a lot of advantage for very, very little. Academy Manufactor right here is probably the best example of that, because very, very simply, he allows an outlet that creates one of 3 token types to generate all 3. And so you could say something like the Underworld Cookbook, for example, that trades a card in your hand for a food on the battlefield. The second you make it a clue, a food, and a treasure token, that value you've gotten has, in a way, tripled, right? Not necessarily, but pretty closely, you've gotten way, way more value. Then, if you had other cards in play, such as Disciple of the Vault, or cards that take like ETBs off of tokens and does something with them, all of a sudden, that tripling that the manufacturer gives then triples another effect, right? And this kind of cascading effect is how engine decks work. They tend to be more combo oriented, but they do sometimes just win by beats or generating a threat so large that your opponents cannot deal with, right? So with that in mind, there's a lot in this deck I really do like, but there are some weaker parts for sure. A few of the weaker parts are generally just the higher mana stuff, but I want to touch on a few of the smaller stuff that catch my eye of not being particularly good enough. So in around 3 mana, we've got Commissar Severina Rain. They still kind of catch my eye as being a card I'm really, really unimpressed by. I really don't understand why this is a $30 card. I can see what makes her really strong in token-based decks, but this is the exact kind of card I don't like in those decks. But I'm not going to get into that because we're really not one of those decks to begin with. So outside of the, 40k flavor, I don't really think she belongs here, especially because she can't even sacrifice artifacts for her ability. So with that in mind, I'm pretty easily going to say cut her, which also adds about $30 to our budget, which is pretty nice. Looking a bit further, I also think, I'm trying to click you, this Basarius Call, once again, it does feel a little bit that it's here for flavor and it's not here for power. And I know we're staying at a bracket level 3, but that means we are dealing with a deck that has access to game changers. And a 4-mana creature that needs to untap, so it needs either haste or get out of summoning sickness, to either create a 2/2 creature, or, I will say more powerfully, look for an artifact, as long as you have enough creatures, feels particularly weak and particularly out of place here. I just don't think this is at the strength. This comes out and is, in a way, an engine piece to look for more engine pieces, but at 4 mana, that's too much. It's something we're just profoundly uninterested in. It is not a very good body because generally, you want to tap it, and if you're holding it as a defensive thing, I don't know what kind of situation you're in that your opponents around turn 4 can't get by a 2/4. It doesn't feel particularly good. I also think the artifact aspect of this actually makes this even weaker because it becomes more vulnerable to more things. So particularly, I don't like it. Just because we're on that trend, Inquisitor Eisenhorn also feels a little weird. The instant and sorcery aspect to this in a deck that is running about 17 instants and sorceries doesn't feel great. The second half where it's deals basically the damage it deals turns into clues. We're going to come back to this in additions, but I don't particularly like when it's on a 4-mana creature that cannot grow itself. If this was like an equipment deck, maybe. If this was an instant or sorcery pump deck, maybe. I really don't like this card, and outside of flavor, I really do want this to be gone. And sorry, I'm just like very much on the 40Ks. Once again, the Space Marine Devastator. I think this is fine in certain decks, but here, once again, this is a mana sink card in a deck that has way, way too many mana sinks. I think I would just rather the cards that for the same mana cost, you get to destroy or exile an artifact and an enchantment. There's a few that let you do this, and all of them I would say are rather, rather good. Whereas this only lets you have one, and the benefit of the squad requires a lot of work. Honestly, I'd rather the Witch Enchanter, which is the land that's the MDFC and has the white, I can't quite remember the name of it, but the white land enchanted something on the back. And I think that's way, way better than this. I didn't put them into my edition, but I do think that the MDFC Bolt lands are very, very good here. Okay. Now the rest of my things are going to be on the higher mana stuff until we get to artifacts, so let's go through them now. I really do feel I can't get away. I know we're still at 4 and not 5. I just really don't like these 40k cards, so we're going to skip them. Obviously Marnius is really, really good. Ignore that, but for the rest, I'm not too impressed with. Okay, let's get to the higher mana stuff. So Eloise is a card I really like. I really like Eloise, and I really don't think we should play it. Eloise belongs in very much so an aristocrat style deck that allows you to really get multiple uses out of artifacts and creature deaths. And though we have some means of that, like we have the Marionette Apprentice, for example, that has the text of both, and we also have down here Agent of the Iron Throne. I like both of these with Eloise, but I think Eloise still demands just more. You really need to use her as your commander or as your secret commander in decks because she asks a lot of you. But when she is strong, she is really, really strong, and I do not think this is the deck that can use her to her full potential. So I think most reasonably she comes out as a 4/4. Without a really good sack outlet, you're just attacking into your opponents and hoping for sacrifices or blocks, and then you are slowly generating clues in a way that's just not very pleasing. There's a card I saw, but I did not put in my editions, that is a 2-mana version that says whenever a creature you control dies, investigate, but it only triggers once a turn. And I would play that years before I would play Eloise in this kind of deck, because the difference between 5 mana and 2 mana is very, very, very vast. If we were playing a ton of instant, like repeatable sacrifice outlets that felt really, really strong, I think maybe I'd change my mind, but that's not the case we're in, so I'd rather get rid of it. Cyberdrive Awakener is a really good card. We're going to get back to it in a moment. Marionette Master, very, very strong. Junk Winder, pretty good. So the rest of that top end I do like. Coming into sorceries, we have Rise and Shine. So that's why I wanted to bring up the Cybermind Awakener. Rise and Shine feels like a worse version of Cybermind Awakener because I'd rather this overload ability to have some kind of body attached to it. We'll get back to this in additions, but Rise and Shine specifically asks a lot of you. It basically is never a 2-mana card because it's just so unlikely for you to want to turn a clue into a 4/4 when instead you could hold up the overload in order to create a board and attack, which is really, really strong, but requires a lot of things to be going your way, right? You really don't want to cast Rise and Shine for Overload and pass your turn. Sure, you have a huge army of creatures, but it's potentially you just created a liability, right? You want to Rise and Shine with like 15 to 20 clues, create a giant army, and attack with it. And with that in mind, I really do think it's win more because that is a really high requirement in a deck that's already struggling with these things. So I think though this feels very much so on theme with what the deck is doing, it seems like a card that functions in multiple zones of or periods of the game. it's not great. It really like gives you the worst of every world because you're going to be constantly feeling the FOMO of not being able to cast the overload. And when you do cast the overload, the timing is not going to be great. Extrementius. Extreminitus? I'm not sure. This is some kind of weird Latin. My understanding, this blows up planets. So here's the thing. I think this is overcosted, right? Because the first line of text that makes your opponents, all the permanents your opponents control lose indestructible, and then you hit destroy all. In this deck, it's effectively merciless eviction, right? If you hit exile all creatures, it gets around indestructible. So why would you play this card? Well, it's pretty straightforwardly that if your team is indestructible, they don't lose indestructible, they survive this, and this becomes a one-sided board wipe. And traditionally, 7 to 9 mana is the cost of a one-sided board wipe. But we aren't playing that. We do not have the means of a ton of indestructible cards, right? So that's off the table. So why are we using this instead of another, farewell or something like that? Well, the answer has to be that we have a lot of cards that just, we want them to die. And so using, merciless eviction gets around that and we don't get any death triggers. I don't think that's particularly good reasoning. I feel like if you really want that, you could just be playing a sack outlet, sacrifice all your creatures, and then cast the exile style effect. And then once again, the question becomes, hey, if we're willing to play a card that gets around indestructibility, why not just play Toxic Deluge, right? That gets around it for less than half the mana, just with a life loss. So once again, this feels like a flavor inclusion, and I don't like it, but I want to be clear, if you want to keep them for flavor, I can't disagree with that. I'm just saying on the merit of the power of the card itself. Very, very strong, but I think at this point, very easily outclassed by a number of black and white cards. Going to the end of instance is the next section where I believe there's some overcosted cards. Deny the Witch. First of all, we love witches. We don't deny any witch around here. Witches deserve everything. But if we were going to cast this kind of card, once again, this doesn't really feel like the deck that wants to be doing this. I don't know to what degree this deck manages to maintain, I would say probably 5 to 6 creatures on board. That would be the numbers I'm looking at, because before that, if Deny the Witch becomes, is it like, there's another Esper card that counters a spell and drains them for 3. I think this needs to hit a higher number. Now, you might say, well, Cursed, I really love the fact that it says counter target spell, activated ability, or triggered ability. But if you want all that text, there's just much better ways to get that for less mana and less colors. So this just becomes a card that very, very specifically is flavor-wise and will sometimes dome your opponents for a little bit. But as you know, this is another card that requires quite a bit of mana. We've been talking about this for a while. This is a deck that requires mana sinks, and so for that in mind, I don't mind it because you can hold up 4 mana and then you can, if you don't cast this, you can sacrifice clues, draw cards. But I still don't think you ever want to cast this. This feels like super, super specific in a deck that you can't use it to protect your own game plan. So you're using this most of the time as counter target spell. And for 4 mana to do like 5 damage, right? Or maybe 6 or 7 damage and counter a spell feels not where you want to be, right? This is a drain deck, so you're doing very little damage to all your opponents at once. So targeted damage is less valuable than like across the border drain. So don't like that. Utter End, once again, I just don't like this. It's too much mana in a deck that's having mana problems. I know we're playing Path and Swords already. I think to an extent we could play Stroke of Midnight if we want to take out permanents. We can play the Gift. I can't remember what it's called. I can't believe I always forget it. The Beast Within in white if we want to destroy lands. Or if we want just more creature removal, I'd rather Dismember. It's just a mana cost thing, and in a deck whose curve kind of rolls out. And I forgot to do that. We forgot to look at the curve. I've been so excited. A deck whose curve kind of rolls off like this, I don't particularly like it. We'll get back to the curve in a second once we're done the cards. Confirmed Suspicion, same idea. This is just very much so overcosted for what it does. I think if this card was counter target spell, draw 3 cards, sure, that's pretty rad. But even then, I don't know to what degree I think that's really, really strong. Your inability to control this, the fact that you have to tap out almost completely to cast this, and if you don't, you're holding up mana just to put into clue tokens in an odd amount too, so you can't even cleanly do it. I think it too much is against this card. I'm sure when it works, it's really, really good, but it ain't no mana drain is what I'm going to say. So I love it, but I don't I don't want it in this deck, unfortunately. Very, very cool card, wanting too much of you. Going into artifacts, I just really want to point out that I think this collection of mana rocks is too much. It's just too many. We're playing too many mana rocks that don't really help our plan. And you might be like, well, Cursed, weren't you saying that we want extra mana on our turns to take advantage of it and get extra effects and then sack more clues? Yeah, this is all true. But we are an engine deck. We need to start putting down cards that do things to put us in the right direction. And there's just too much here that is way more valuable than a mana rock, and there's too few things that require us to use a mana rock to get into, right? Our 4 mana cards here, outside of like Braids, let's say, which is just an insane card, we don't really need to rush into a lot of these. These Space Marines are also just not very good, so we don't particularly want to rush into them. Mirkwood Bats doesn't do much until we're already ahead. At least Ethereal Investigator is good. Our Commander is fine, but all of these in mind, I just think the 2 mana rocks are bad. If you haven't watched my video on 2 mana rocks, I really recommend you do. I really don't like them, and I think they particularly hold back decks, especially decks like this. The rest of the artifacts I love. Enchantments I also really, really like. So let's kind of go backwards and finish off with the land count and the curve, kind of solidifying what I've been thinking. As some of my patrons have noticed, because these deck lists are posted on the Discord, if you'd like to see them early, you can join the Patreon. This deck is running a bit few lands for a deck that I really think feels like it wants to make all its land drops. So I wouldn't mind at least putting 2 extra lands in, pretty easy. And if, you know, one of those is a MDFC, that would be nice. If both of them are, that's not too bad. Coming down here at the curve, we can see that we have kind of a 2-drop situation, which is not terrible, but it's really worth considering that since clues require 2 mana to crack, having everything at 2 mana creates an inherent kind of tension in the deck. It's not a crazy tension because you don't have to crack the clues on curve. You can just crack them when you can. But it is worth noting. These are the kind of things that I really want people who watch these videos to kind of pay attention to, because this is just an inherent, I'm not going to say nombo, but friction in the deck that's really valuable to look at. Likewise, this friction, of course, goes to 4 mana, because 4 mana represents 2 clues. So there's a lot of cards here, many of which I've already kind of flagged as cards I'm not particularly interested in, that can be here. And if we remove them, that kind of pressure goes away. Because every time you play Search the Premises, for example, you have to think that I've given up cracking 2 clues. And that can make a really big difference in the long run. Or, let's do it backwards. Perhaps you've cracked the clues and you've drawn into Search the Premises, and now you go, oh, I can no longer cast this card on the turn that I need it because I ran out of cards, had to crack the clues, and now this is too much mana. Okay. Before we go into additions, I'm just noting 2 cards that really do catch my eye. Contraband Kingpin really feels too cute. I do understand how this works as a pseudo engine piece that helps you funnel down for other engine pieces, and that's great. But it is a bad card and really hard to empower. If we were playing things like Nettle Cyst or other cards that would grow creatures very conveniently into making them bigger threats, perhaps Contraband Kingpin gets a lot better because that lifelink is not nothing. But as is, it is a particularly weak card that I'm not very interested in. Likewise, Denic Pious Apprentice. The front side is not a card I particularly like. Backside, obviously this works a lot better, but once again, we're in that situation where we are comparing this to that 2-mana black card that does this text, just this text by itself. It doesn't need to be transformed. It doesn't cost 5 mana like Eloise. It's just fine. Denic, on the other hand, I feel is just doing far too much because you need to naturally put in your graveyard, which this deck struggles with. And so we're playing a 2/3 that protects a part of your deck that you don't care about. Sure, it stops Reanimator, but like this isn't the kind of deck that suffers against Reanimator because it does have Path, Swords of Plowshares, Arcane Denial. It has a lot of answers to this. It has board clears. So this feels like a really, really weak card included in the deck. Okay, let's go into additions. And something that was pointed out was card draw from some of my patrons, and one of my patrons brought this up, and I think it is a really good point. They were looking for more instant-based card draw. What I really want is more reliable, consistent card draw. When it comes to 1 or 2 cards here and there, I think the clues are doing a really, really good job, but I want a constant stream of cards coming into this deck, and where better to find this kind of ability but Dark Confidant, you know, father to my imaginary children. Great, great card. Just got reprinted in Final Fantasy, so it is, once again, particularly cheap. I do like this art, despite my feelings on Universes Beyond, and I really think if you haven't had the pleasure of playing this card, this is a great time to buy into it. It is very, very strong. It works really well in a deck like this, where the majority of your deck is below 3 mana, and it's just going to make a nice little difference as you play turn by turn. This is the main one, and the other main one is Black Market Connections, mainly because of Sell Contraband, because I do really like this text that allows you to create a treasure token, which is another kind of token, another kind of artifact, so it has a natural synergy with the deck. But of course, this buy information line is particularly strong to me. You can compare it, even though it feels a bit overpriced, you can compare it to a Dark Confidant trigger, because in the deck, most Dark Confidant triggers are going to dome you for 2, so this is very, very equivalent. That being said, if you were interested in playing, let's say, Phyrexian Arena, Necroponents, Necrodominance, any of those 3 cards, maybe not in that order, those would be pretty interesting to me. Now, Necroponents, I believe, is now on the Game Changers list, which breaks my heart, but is probably correct. But Necrodom isn't. So I would probably think about starting with Necrodominance. After that, Phyrexian Arena is always a good card, always a great card, and including here is pretty easy. Once again, we're looking for ways to just kind of give us some natural draw so that we can play a land, play a card every single turn, and get very, very far with that. Moving on, Forensic Gadgeteer. I really wanted to include this, not for that first line of text, but that second line of text that makes our clues 1 less to activate. Now, we have a lot of, at least 3-ish cards that I saw in our deck that functionally do this in different ways, right? Cards that, there's that white-black card that says, you know, 1 mana, sacrifice an artifact, draw a card. This is very similar to that, and I believe we have a blue creature that taps, sacks an artifact, draws a card. These effects are all very, very powerful, and I think they really are, I think they're very key to getting your deck working, because having all of those clues out, you know, as we get into it, and I haven't forgotten about clue generation, we'll get to that, but having all those clues come out is really quite important, and then when they're out, we need to do something with them. And a way to get around the innate kind of tension about spending mana and clues instead of, you know, furthering your board is to literally halve the cost of it. And Forensic Gadgeteer is just another version of that. I think it's going to make a big difference to draw into one of these every game, because then all of a sudden you're going to be accelerating your game plan quite quickly. Because this not just only helps you see more cards, but it lets you naturally trigger a lot of those cards that care tokens going to the graveyard, which you otherwise have a harder time doing. So really easy inclusion if you ask me. Speaking of investigation triggering, right? Or clue generation. Piper Wright does this really, really well. She has that line of text that I liked on that other card that says when it deals combat damage to a player, generate that many clues. but she as well has the ability to pump herself or others as your deck is functioning and sacrificing clues. So I love this because she is very much so an enabler and a payoff. She's a great piece in any engine, especially on this side, and lets you do things and grow creatures that you might be struggling with otherwise. If you think of her as a really good 2-mana play that can start attacking and generating clues early on, and immediately after that start growing and generating more and more clues, you're going to be very, very happy with her. I think this is an impressive card here, and I would definitely play it. Another card that I think is very much so missing is Kambal Profiteering Mare. Obviously, we want it on that second side where it says whenever one or more tokens you control enter, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. And I think that's particularly strong. Once again, it hits all of your opponents. It triggers on one of the 2 halves of creating and sacking tokens, which is really nice. And it generates quite a bit of drain over time that can be very valuable. But that second line of text, whenever 1 or more tokens your opponents control enter, for each of them, create a tap token that's a copy of it. This is a lot stronger than I think people are aware of. I think it is very much so depending on your play group and what's going on, but I just played a game today where I watched each of my opponents generate either clues or treasures every single one of their turns. Actually, this is funny. My first opponent, she generated clues. My second opponent, he generated treasures. And my third opponent, he generated soldiers, like 1/1 soldier tokens. So when you think about that, Kambal on that field would be just insane because it would just soft generate a bunch of tokens. Now, once again, obviously there's that combination with that second half to drain your opponents, but I don't even think you care. Getting a clue token, a treasure token, a creature token for free, as long as Kambal is out, is just really, really powerful, and I think you're going to benefit from it quite a bit. So this is a very easy pick for me that I think will do a lot of work. Speaking of 3-mana creatures and below, this deck particularly feels that Unearth is very, very good here. You just have so many cards under 3 mana and under that are just so valuable and so powerful that I think I really, really want Unearth. Of course, once again, we live in a world that Unearth can just be reanimate because of budget concerns, but I always like starting with Unearth and then moving beyond thereafter. I think this is just really good to rebuy a number of your creatures that are very valuable, and I'm even thinking just stuff such as braids, like the Nightmare braids, that can do so much in your deck that it's very, very easy for your opponents to bolt or otherwise remove it, and just being able to unearth it and start again is going to make such a big difference. So really nice reanimation card. Generally, if you're in black, I think it's free to play reanimation cards. So please do. I think I just love this card, and I think it's going to be very powerful. On that note, I didn't say Dark Ritual because I don't think it necessarily belongs here, but for what it's worth, you could play Dark Ritual. It could be a very free card in a deck like this. Another card that feels free in a deck like this is Time Thief. Time Thief is a very, very strong card that if we're in mass artifact generation, it can do so much work. Now, I know it's generally thought of an infinite take turn deck or infinite takes turn ability. I've quite rarely seen it do that. A lot of the stars have to align that you can naturally repeatedly generate 5 artifacts a turn cycle in order for Time Thief to do what you want without your opponents interacting in any way. However, I will say that this deck might be the one to be able to do it. If you use Piper Right, and she's got like 5+1/+1 counters or 4+1/+1 counters on it, and then one opponent hasn't attacked, you can slam Time Thief, attack, generate 5 clues, sack the 5 clues. There you got your infinite turns. But even if you can't do that, even if this just represents a second turn every 2 turns, that's going to be just incredibly powerful, and you're going to be particularly happy with it. Yeah, in fact, it makes me think that there are those white mana spells, that 2 mana that says reanimate creature 3 mana or less, or reanimate artifact 3 mana or less, that could also be played because of cards like Time Thief. But really like Time Thief here. And I think this is the final card. I kind of said this very early talking about animation, and I think Tangle Trove Kelp is the kind of artifact animation that I really, really like in this deck. I love the fact that this card has ward. That's very, very rare on these kind of cards, which is nice. I love it makes the creatures into 6/6s and only in combat. Sorry, only from combat to end of turn, so not the entirety of the turn, but most of the turn. It's just really, really strong, and I think it does a really good impression of these kind of cards like Rise and Shine that do really well, but is still a powerful creature and drops a very strong body that you're not going to be thinking, oh, I only use this weekly at the start of the game when I could have done better. We're finished here, but I did want to go back and touch the idea of clue generation. So if I wanted to say, here's a few more generation cards, I would say there is the Novice Inspector, which is the equivalent of Thraben Inspector, but from Murders. That could be just another bit of redundancy. I could suggest that you put like Ephemerate or something that works with these kind of cards, works with Wurnog. I could suggest maybe you play Wurnog and another partner as your commander instead to generate clues. But I do think this deck is already built to generate clues in a pretty nice way. I think what's happening here is maybe the deck is having a bit of a struggle in deciding how many clues it needs. What I mean by that is like cards like Rise and Shine, and this is even including the Tangled Trove Kelp that I just suggested, really encourage you to have 30 clues, right? Which means you have to invest a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of triggers to slowly amass a ton of clues that you don't want to spend because they're coming in slowly. But on the other hand, cards like Braids or Risen Nightmare, which, as I said before, and I will say again, is an insane card and very powerful, really cares for you to have one clue generated a turn, right? And so that tension kind of exists here, where we have a deck with cards that just want you to lightly generate clues, and a deck that wants you to generate a ton of clues and not sacrifice them in the meantime. And perhaps something you can do is find a medium between these two, or go in a direction that catches your attention more to have a little more smoothness into the deck. Me, very easily, I would say I want more cards like Braids because they just represent so much damage and so much power that I want to go all in on that. But that might just not be the case, right? You might want to go into more of the generate clues and never stop and never sack them, and then the other cards get better. But it is something worth noting when you are deck building to see these kind of tensions and see what you can do with them. Okay, that's it for me. Thank you so much, Xavier, for sending the deck. It looks like a lot of fun. I really like these kind of artifact decks. And there's a few versions of this style of deck that I've played before, so I do love this kind of build. There is something to be said. There is that Sphinx from New Capenna that could also be an alternative commander where it comes into play and you generate 4 artifacts, and some of them can be clues. That could be an alternative way to play it because it lets you get that those amount of clues out really, really early, and the rest of the deck can benefit from it. But I leave that up to you. Also, I think it's 6 mana, and I said early, so maybe don't listen to everything I say. Thank you so much, good luck, and happy deck building. Thank you so much for watching. This video is brought to you by viewers like you and people on my Patreon. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, or any deck, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you'd like to make your deck one of my donation decks I work on, there's a link there too. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, I would be very appreciative. It helps the channel quite a bit. Thank you and good luck in brewing and building.